Chapter 2. Chichikov had been in town for more than a week, going to receptions and dinners and having what might be described as a very pleasant time. Then he decided to extend his visits beyond the town limits and to drop in on Manilov and Sobakevich, as he had promised. Or perhaps it was another more substantial motive, something more important, closer to his heart, that impelled him to go. But the reader will find out about it all in good time if he is patient enough to follow this rather long story that will broaden in scope as it approaches its culmination. Selifan, the coachman, was ordered to harness the horses to the carriage early in the morning. Petrushka was told to stay home and look after the room and the trunk. Now the reader might well make the acquaintance of these two serfs of Chichikov's, although, of course, they are not important characters and could be called secondary or even less. Although the mainsprings and movements of this epic are not dependent on them and the narrative barely touches them, still, the author likes to be extremely thorough in everything and, although himself a Russian, wishes in this respect to be as precise as a German. And anyway, it will take up only a little time and space because there is no need to add much to what the reader already knows, i.e. that Petrushka went around in a rather loose-fitting, hand-me-down brown frock coat and had, as is customary with people of his calling, a large nose and thick lips. By nature, he was more taciturn than talkative and even had a noble impulse toward learning, that is, the reading of books, although he was not in the least concerned with what they had to impart. It made absolutely no difference to him whether he read the adventures of a lovelorn hero, a child's primer, or a prayer book. He read everything with equal attention, and had a treatise on chemistry fallen into his hands, he wouldn't have spurned it. It wasn't what he read that pleased him, but rather the reading itself. The fact that a word of some kind somehow always came out of the letters, although sometimes God alone knew just what it meant. His reading was usually performed in a supine position, stretched out on his bed in the anteroom, and because of this his mattress had become as kneaded and as thin as a dough cake. Besides his passion for reading, he had two other peculiarities. He slept just as he was, without undressing, coat and all, and he carried around with him his own personal aura, a peculiar smell, somewhat redolent of crowded quarters, so that it was enough for him to move his bed and his belongings, even into a formerly uninhabited room, and right away it seemed as if people had been living there for years. Being rather sensitive and, on occasion, downright squeamish, Chichikov, on taking in a breath of air through a fresh nose in the morning, would screw up his face, shake his head, and remark, "Damn it, man, what's the matter with you? You must be sweating or something. Couldn't you pay a visit to the bathhouse at least?" Petrushka wouldn't answer, but instead would become very busy with something, either taking a brush to his master's frock coat or simply straightening something or other, probably thinking, "You can talk, you who keep repeating the same thing 40 times over." God knows, it's hard to imagine what a household serf thinks about when his master tells him off. And for now, enough of Petrushka. The coachman, Selifan, was quite different. But the author is quite conscience-stricken at taking up so much of his reader's time with lower-class people, aware as he is of their reluctance to get to know such types. That's a Russian for you. He has a passion for knowing anyone superior to him, if only a notch, and a nodding acquaintance with a count or prince is more important to him than the closest friendship with an ordinary citizen. The author even has misgivings about a hero who's simply a collegiate counselor. Court counselors might be willing to know him, but those who have reached the select higher ranks might, God knows, cast one of those contemptuous glances at him, which the proud cast at everything that crawls at their feet, or, even worse, they might cut him dead, which would be fatal to the author. But however deplorable all this may be, we must still return to our hero. Having issued his instructions the evening before, he rose very early, gave himself a rub-down from head to foot with a wet sponge, a thing he did only on Sundays, this being Sunday, shaved so that his cheeks were smooth and glossy, and put on the scintillating cranberry red frock coat and then a thick bearskin-lined overcoat. He went downstairs, supported now on one side, now on the other by the inn servant, and got into his carriage. The carriage rattled through the inn gate onto the street. A passing priest raised his hat. A few little boys in dirty shirts held out their hands, crying, "Sir, give to a poor orphan." The coachman, noticing one of them trying to jump up on the back step, swung his whip at him, and the carriage set off, bouncing over the cobbles. A striped toll gate in the distance, indicating that the cobbles, like all other torments, would soon come to an end, was a welcome sight, and after hitting his head quite hard a few more times against the side of the carriage, Chichikov finally found himself traveling over soft ground. Hardly had they left the town behind when, as is usual in this land of ours, all sorts of stuff and nonsense appeared on both sides of the road. Hillocks, a fir grove, sparse, stumpy, scrubby young pines and the charred stumps of old ones, wild heather and such rubbish. They came across villages strung out like beads on a string. The houses looked like old wood piles under their gray roofs, decorated with fretwork like embroidered towels hung up to dry. As usual, a few peasants in sheepskin jackets sat yawning on benches by doorsteps. Fat-faced women, their bosoms well wrapped in shawls, stared out of upper windows, while out of the lower ones a calf would peer, or a pig would thrust its blind snout. In a word, the usual sights. When they had gone 12 miles, it occurred to Chichikov that, according to what Manilov had said, this was where his village should be. But another mile flew by, and still no village in sight. And as a matter of fact, if they hadn't met two peasants, they would hardly have found their way. When asked if Zemenilovka was still some distance, the peasants took off their hats, and the more intelligent one, with a wedge-shaped beard, asked, "Could it be Manilovka and not Zemenilovka?" "Well, yes, Manilovka." "Ah, Manilovka. Well, when you've gone another mile, there you are. That is straight to the right." "To the right?" the coachman asked. "To the right," the peasant said. "That'll be your road to Manilovka. As for Zemenilovka, there ain't no such place. That's what it's called, just Manilovka. And there ain't no Zemenilovka here at all. You'll see the house right up on the hill there, a stone one, 2 stories. The manor house. That is the one where the gentleman himself lives. And there's your Manilovka. But there ain't no such place as Zemenilovka around here, and never was." They went on in search of Manilovka. After a couple of miles, they came to the turn, but then they continued for what seemed like 2 or 3 miles more, and still no sign of a 2-story stone house. At this point, Chichikov remembered that if a friend invites one to his village 12 miles away, it usually means that there'll actually be 25 miles to go. The village of Manilovka would hardly have attracted many people by its location. The manor house stood by itself in the open on a hill, exposed to every wind that might take it into its head to blow. The slope of the hill on which it stood was covered with close-clipped turf. Scattered over it, in English style, were 2 or 3 beds with lilac and yellow acacia bushes. Clusters of 5 or 6 birches raised their sparse, small-leafed tops here and there. Under 2 of these trees one could discern a summer house with a low green cupola, pale blue wooden columns, and an inscription which read, "Temple of Solitary Meditation." Below it was a weed-covered pond, a thing, incidentally, which is no rarity in the English gardens of Russian landowners. At the foot of the hill and along part of the slope itself stood some dingy, grayish log huts, which Chichikov at once started to count for some reason. He counted more than 200. Nowhere among them was there even a sprig of anything green growing. One could see nothing but the logs of the huts. The view was enlivened by two peasant women who, with their skirts picturesquely gathered up and tucked in all around, were wading up to their knees in the pond, dragging a torn net by two wooden grapples. In the net there were two entangled crayfish and a shiny roach. The women were quarreling, shouting at each other. Farther away, a dark pine forest showed gloomily bluish. Even the weather fitted the picture. The day was neither bright nor rainy, but a sort of pale gray, such as is only seen in the old uniforms of garrison soldiers. A peaceful lot, incidentally, but not always very sober on Sundays. To make the picture complete, there was the usual rooster. Although his head had been pecked through almost to the very brain by the beaks of other roosters over certain matters of gallantry, this herald of changeable weather was crowing loudly and even flapping his wings, which were as tattered as old straw matting. As they neared the house, Chichikov made out the green-coated master himself standing on the porch and shielding his eyes with his hand so as to see the approaching carriage better. The closer the carriage came to the porch, the more merrily his eyes sparkled and the wider grew his smile. "My dear friend," he exclaimed as Chichikov at last stepped out of the carriage. "So you remembered us after all." The friends embraced warmly and Manilov led his guest inside. "Although it won't take them long to cross the entrance hall and go through the dining room, we'll try to say something here about the master of the house. But it must be confessed that this is a difficult undertaking. It is much easier to paint a character of grand dimensions. You just have to splash the colors onto the canvas: fiery black eyes, beetling brows, a furrowed forehead, a cloak, black or flame red flung over the shoulder, and there you have it. But gentlemen like Manilov, of whom the world is full, who look very much alike, but on a second look turn out to have many very subtle peculiarities, these are terribly difficult to portray. You have to concentrate hard to bring out all the fine, almost imperceptible traits, and in general, you have to pry very deep, however practiced an observer you may be. Perhaps God alone could tell what Manilov was like. There's a kind of person who can be described as just so-so, neither fish nor fowl, and perhaps Manilov should be placed in this group. He was certainly personable to look at. His face was amiable, but this amiability was rather too sugary. In his manner and speech, there was something obviously intended to gain favor and friendship. He had an ingratiating smile, blonde hair, and blue eyes. When you first got into conversation with him, you couldn't help saying, "What a nice, kind person." Later, you wouldn't say anything. And after that, you'd say, "Damned if I know what it's all about," and get away from him. Or, if you failed to do so, you'd succumb to deadly boredom. He never uttered a word indicating that he really felt anything, even anger, which, after all, almost anyone will show you if you touch on some sore spot. Everyone has his pet enthusiasm. One may be enthusiastic about hounds. Another fancies himself a great connoisseur of music, able to appreciate its profoundest passages. A third is a great gourmet. A fourth insists that his position is more important, if only a tiny bit, than it really is. A fifth's dreams are confined to being seen in the company of an aide-de-camp by his friends and acquaintances, and even by people he doesn't know. A sixth may have a hand that itches to place a bet on the ace or the two of diamonds, while the seventh's hand tends to fly out to punish some station master or coachman. In a word, everyone has his own peculiarity, whereas Manilov had none. At home, he spoke little and spent most of his time in thought and contemplation. But God alone knows what he thought about. It can hardly be said that he ran his estate. He never even drove out to the fields. The estate somehow took care of itself. When his manager said, "Wouldn't it be a good idea to do this or that, sir?" he'd answer, "Yes, not bad," and puff away at his pipe, a habit he had acquired when in the army, where he was considered the most self-effacing, the most tactful, the most cultured of officers. "Yes, indeed, not a bad idea at all," he would repeat. When a peasant came to him, scratching the back of his head, and said, "Allow me, sir, to go and earn some money to pay my taxes," he'd say, "Go ahead," still puffing at his pipe. and it never occurred to him that the peasant just wanted to go off and get drunk. Sometimes, surveying the yard and the pond from the porch, he would muse aloud about how nice it would be to dig an underground passage from the house or to build a stone bridge across the pond with little stores on either side of it, and have merchants sitting in them and selling various small items to the peasants. Then his eyes would grow soft and his face would take on a most contented expression. However, all these projects ended there. In his study, there was a book with a bookmark in it at page 14. A book he had been reading constantly for 2 years. There was always something missing in his house. His drawing room furniture was excellent. It was upholstered in a costly silken material, but it had turned out that there wasn't enough of it for 2 of the armchairs, so they stood there covered with sackcloth. For several years now, the master of the house had been warning his guests, "Don't sit in those chairs, please. They're not yet ready." In some of the rooms, there was no furniture at all, although immediately after the marriage, the newlyweds had said to each other, "We must see to it tomorrow, darling, that some furniture is put in here, even if only temporarily." After dark, a servant would place a very elegant bronze candlestick decorated with the 3 graces and an exquisite mother-of-pearl escutcheon on the dining table. Then, next to it, another candlestick, an old crippled brass one, lame, lopsided, and all covered with wax, would be placed. But neither the master nor the mistress nor the servants ever noticed the incongruity of it all. Now, as to his wife. But then, they were quite satisfied with each other. Although they had been married for more than 8 years, they still kept giving each other such items as a slice of apple, a piece of candy, or a nut, and addressing each other with touching tenderness. As, for instance, "Open your little mouth, my pet, and let me pop this tidbit in it." It goes without saying that the little mouth did indeed open, and quite gracefully at that. On their birthdays, they would prepare surprises for each other. Something like a teeny-weeny, bead-covered sheath for his toothpick. Frequently, as they sat on their divan, he would abruptly abandon his pipe and she her sewing, if she happened to be sewing at the moment, and, without provocation, impress such a lengthy and languishing kiss upon each other's lips that, while it lasted, you could easily smoke a small cigar to the end. To be brief, they were what is called happy. Certainly, however, in any household, there are many other chores besides kissing and preparing surprises for one another, and certain questions remained. Why, for instance, was the kitchen run so stupidly? Why was the larder almost empty? Why did the housekeeper steal? Why were the servants dirty and drunk as well most of the time? Why did all members of the household sleep incredibly long hours and spend the rest of the time eating and drinking? But these are unworthy matters, and Manilov's wife had been brought up a lady. It is a well-established fact that a proper upbringing is obtained in boarding schools at which 3 subjects are considered the foundation of all human virtue. The French language, indispensable to family happiness. The pianoforte, to afford pleasant moments for one's spouse. And finally, the subject which touches directly upon the running of one's future home, the knitting of purses and other presents with which to surprise one's husband. Of course, there are variations in method, especially today, and everything depends on the ability and tact of the headmistresses of such establishments. Thus, in some schools, the order of priority may be pianoforte, then French, and only after that household duties, while in others the emphasis may be on the household duties, i.e., the knitting of surprises, then French, and only after that the pianoforte. There are all sorts of methods. I ought perhaps to add that Manilov's lady, but I confess I am reluctant to talk about ladies, and Besides, it is high time for me to go back to our main characters, who have now been standing before the drawing room doors for several minutes, each urging the other to enter first.